Hello everyone and welcome to today's lesson. Today we will focus on an argument that's not usually touched upon in our schools, but that is very relevant for today's world, and that is very, very important. Do you want to know why? Because it's signed the beginning of the era. If you are wondering what argument we're talking about, is Fascist Italy and the creation of the Italian Republic. Now, this might not be interesting because this doesn't really concern non-Italian people. But trust me, it is. And you'll learn this through this documentary. But I'm not going to teach you this argument like an ordinary teacher would do. It would be too boring, wouldn't it? In fact, I will use several sources to help the realization of this documentary. Sources will be objects, documents, books, photographs, and even interviews to survivors. Let's get into it, shall we? Before starting though, I think it would be appropriate trying to address an issue or a question that many of you are asking yourselves right now. How did fascism start? What were the origins of fascism? This is very important to know because it was what really changed 20th century history in Italy. Now, fascism started in late 1918, and it really became a powerful part and a significant part of politics when the March on Rome took place. It took place between the 28th and the 31st of October 1922, and its goal was overthrowing the Second Facta government. And it saw over 50,000 black shirts marching all across Rome. Happenings like the March on Rome were so scary and threatening to politics that the last day of the march, King Victor Emmanuel III decreed that Benito Mussolini, head of fascism, would be in charge of creating the new government, making his rise to power the next day. Now, from then on, that's when things really started to escalate. The 3rd of January 1925, Benito Mussolini declared the state of dictatorship in Italy, depriving all Italian citizens of right to vote and freedom of speech. February the 11th, 1929, the later pacts were signed, establishing a bond between the clergy and the non-religious government until then of Italy. 3rd of October 1935, the invasion of Ethiopia started, weakening the relationship between the League of Nations in Italy. The 1st of November 1936, the Axis powers were established, creating a very strong bond between Imperial Japan, Fascist Italy, and Nazi Germany. In 1937, Italy leaves the League of Nations, only to announce 1 year later the stipulation of the racial laws, the 18th of September 1938. But how must have been life during the fascist era? Well, for sure, this is a very difficult question to answer for the simple reason that the idea and ideal of life back in the day is very different from the conception of daily life that we have right now. So there's only a way to properly understand, which is looking at sources, meeting people that lived during that time period, and visiting the places that have been shaped by the fascist regime. Now, of course, we could even learn this through daily objects because everything was shaped according to the country's ideas. Now, a very good example are stamps, where you can always find the faces or the fasces that was the symbol of the fascist regime. But in order to make this even more accurate, we went to Rome and visited this place.
One of the signs and demonstrations of the greatness that fascism wanted to convey is this one, Via della Conciliazione, leading up to St. Peter's Cathedral. Now, this road was built by under the order of Benito Mussolini, and it was aimed at showing how great Italy was to the eyes of the whole of the Italian population and the populations of the whole world. Now, unluckily though, in order to make this road, several different houses had to be destroyed, thus ruining the surprise effect wanted by Bernini when seeing the actual St. Peter's Cathedral. Fascism was a time where history was disregarded, and everything, starting from daily life, was shaped according to the fascist ideas and the ideals of the party. Luckily, those at this period lasted only 21 years.
Now, let's explore daily life under fascist Italy and the fascist regime. Now, almost every object and every single aspect of life was touched by political propaganda, starting from banknotes of money displaying the image of the king, and the fasces, which was at the time the symbol of fascist Italy, going also to, of course, coins and postcards like this one that displays the greatness of Italy and how good it was, and how the aircraft was great and able to make a cruise all the way across the Atlantic, reaching America. But one really touching and peculiar aspect that is usually found in dictatorships is that political propaganda also concerned children. Let me show you. What I mean by this is that Boy Scouts were effectively abolished. Boy Scouts didn't exist anymore. It was illegal to be a Boy Scout. And these were substituted by a movement called Balilla. This concerned children up to the age of 8 and all the way up to and over the age of 18 years old. There were two groups divided in men and women, or male and female, and they did different things. Men were taught sports, were taught how to fight, how to handle guns, whereas women were taught how to be housewives, how to do normal houseworks, and also how to dance or to do stereotypical feminine sports. Also, there is a very famous picture here that displays a child dressed as a balilla, basically drinking a drink. So they were also used as a marketing campaign. Also, in schools, everything was shaped by the fascist regime. You can see here, this is a photo portraying one of those typical school reports. And as you can see, there's an image of Benito Mussolini saying hi to children or greeting children, and there are 3 faces and the symbol of the Italian kingdom. But not only, sports were also affected a lot by fascism. Fascism was a movement that really encouraged sports and that really encouraged the well-being of its citizens. So nearly everyone was obliged to do certain sports, also adults. So here there are pictures portraying cyclists and horse riders during the fascist era. And here a picture portraying some women dancing under the fascist era. So fascism effectively concerned everyone and everything, starting from jobs all the way to having fun and to actual doing physical activity or going to school. Now, it's common belief thinking that fascism is a political ideal that it's racist at its roots, but it's not really, or at least not quite. Because initially, unlike Nazism, fascism wasn't born to be racist, and it became racist only in the second half of its entire duration. In fact, it became racist only against people that initially weren't part of a country, officially and effectively, because they came from colonies. They were people who came from Libya, Ethiopia, Abyssinia, and Eritrea. Now let me explain myself a bit better. Now, what I mean by this is that countries like Ethiopia, Eritrea, Abyssinia, and Libya were considered as part of Italian land. They were seen actually as Italian land. but the people were not considered as Italian citizens. Usually they were seen as objects, and racial laws were applied to them. As you can see on the postcards and pieces of propaganda that I have displayed on the screen, they were seen as objects and clearly inferior to Italian people or Italian citizens in general.
Io sono nato nel 1928, quindi nel 1938, quando sono state emanate le leggi contro gli ebrei, le leggi anti-ebraiche, dal governo fascista, come sappiamo, io avevo 10 anni e avevo finito le elementari, veramente l'avevo finito un anno prima perché volevo andare prima al ginnasio. Sono nato a Napoli e nella famiglia avevo 5 fratelli maschi, io il terzo, e quando facevo la quarta elementare ho fatto la quarta e la quinta insieme perché l'anno successivo pensavo di andare a scuola per i miei fratelli più grandi. Ho fatto qualche quinto, ho fatto l'esame e ero stato ammesso con buoni voti, e se no che a settembre, quando sono state emanate le leggi, i nostri genitori ci hanno chiamato tutti e 5 e ci hanno detto che non potevamo più andare a scuola perché il governo fascista aveva emanato delle leggi, e la prima di queste leggi vietava ai bambini ebrei, definiti di razza ebraica, tra l'altro è una parola bruttissima, questa è la parola razza riferita a bambini, a esseri umani, e quindi la vita è cambiata completamente. La mia reazione, questo lo dico sempre, quindi lo ripeto anche qui, perché molti mi domandano come abbiamo reagito. Io sono scoppiato a piangere perché ho visto che svaniva un sogno, un programma, e ho visto proprio che mi crollava il mondo addosso. Però non si può piangere tanto, c'era poco, bisognava imboccarsi le maniche e certo ho chiesto ai miei genitori, ma io se non si va per scuola che succede? Non studieremo più, resteremo ignoranti. A Napoli gli ebrei erano pochi, qualche centinaio, quindi non c'era la possibilità di formare una scuola di soli ebrei, cosa che hanno fatto a Roma e a Milano. E quindi si studia privatamente, si studiava a casa. Io ho studiato per 5 anni, ho studiato privatamente, però studiando privatamente, finito l'anno scolastico, io che facendo la prima non avevo il passaggio in seconda, e allora dovevamo fare l'esame come privatisti. Questa sessione privatista ci conoscevamo, professori di varie età, diverso dall'alto estate del 1939, io ho fatto gli esami per andare in seconda. E quando sono andata, siccome si filmava il foglio di presenza, quando ho cominciato gli esami, e quando ho firmato il foglio di presenza ho visto in ordine alfabetico, vicino al mio nome, Foa Ugo, c'era scritto di razza ebraica. E quindi insomma era abbastanza mortificante questa etichetta. Che poi io l'esame mi sono presentato all'esame, ho firmato naturalmente, mi sono seduto. No, dopo che aveva dettato il tema la professoressa, la presidente della commissione, ha detto: ma dove sei Foa? Dico: sono qui. Dice: no, tu non puoi stare seduto vicino agli altri, tu ti devi alzare e devi andare a sedere in fondo a quest'aula dove c'è quel banco isolato. Io insomma mi sono alzato. Però qui c'è un episodio, è successo una cosa molto bella, perché questa professoressa che mi ha detto: Foa, ti devi alzare, devi andare all'ultimo banco perché non devi stare da solo, come fossi un appestato. Poi dopo, quando girava per vedere se copiavamo, per vedere se tutto su, è venuto vicino a me e mi ha dato un colpo sulla spalla dicendo: Foa, coraggio, questo passerà. Eravamo sotto la dittatura fascista, quindi lei ha eseguito l'ordine che gli ebrei dovevano essere messi all'ultimo banco se c'erano e stare lontani dagli altri. Dopo ha sentito il dovere umano di venire e dare questa parola che per me ha significato tanto in quel momento.
This is the sad and tragic story of Ugo Foa. But the story is not finished here, unluckily, because his story isn't positive. In fact, only 2 years after the stipulation this is just another obstacle for him to surpass and to overcome. But not only for him, for the whole of the Italian population. For this reason, we're not only going to focus on the life conditions and lifetime during World War II for people of Jewish origin, but also for the rest of the population. The 10th of June 1940, in fact, Benito Mussolini made a speech at Palazzo Venezia, a very famous yet infamous one. Now, in this speech, he of course declared war, and that signed the beginning of World War II for Italy. We've been there, and let's see how it looks now.
It's right there, from the balcony that you just saw, that now proudly displays the Italian and the European Union flag. On the 10th June 1940, Benito Mussolini announced the start of World War II for Italy. In his speech, Mussolini called to his aid the whole of the Italian population and announced that Italy would be formally allied with Germany against Great Britain and France. The really interesting thing about this balcony, though, is that in order to never forget, and in order to always remember what's happened in the past, and in order to never imitate a person like Benito Mussolini, no one else ever gave a speech on that balcony since 1940.
Of course, back in the day, the situation was much different. And as you have seen in the videos, it's full of people roaming around because it's a very famous tourist attraction, and because there's the Colosseum nearby, there's the Teatro Marcello nearby, and there's the Altare della Patria. But the reason why there were many people the 10th of June 1940 is for a much different reason, and it was for sure not tourism. In fact, the reason was Mussolini's speech. You need to imagine the square full of people. Because believe it or not, Mussolini's speeches, for how boring and kind of monotonous they might seem for today's world, or nowadays, they were actually very, very, very persuasive. At the time, he was the man. He was the man of the year, the man of the era. He was the ruler of Italy, admired by everyone, or nearly everyone, as we will see later. And because everyone basically was fascist, because either they strongly believed in the idea of fascism, or because they were forced to, because that's true. Fascism came in Italy through violence, and through threatening not only the March on Rome, but when the actual votes took place, there were the black shirts that threatened people to kill them or to hurt them really, really badly if they didn't vote for the fascist party. So this is how people came to like Mussolini as a person and as a leader. He wasn't considered a boss. He was considered as a leader who would eventually bring the nation on his shoulders to glory. Now, in order to have a very good idea of this, let's listen to one of his speeches and see the video and the footage from one of his speeches. To make it even more relevant, I decided to choose the speech that we're talking about, the Declaration of War.
Combattenti di terra, di mare, dell'aria, camicie nere della rivoluzione e delle legioni, uomini e donne d'Italia, dell'impero e del regno d'Albania, ascoltate. Un'ora segnata dal destino, batte nel cielo della nostra patria. delle decisioni irrevocabili.
Listen to the screams of the people, to the acclamations to Mussolini that the people were doing. This really shows how fond the population was of their dictator, of their leader at the time, and how excited they were of starting a war. Before moving on to the next chapter, I'd like to address the fact that the person that we met at the time was only a child. He was just over 10 years old when the racial laws were stipulated. In fact, it is pretty difficult nowadays trying to understand how an adult person must have lived under the fascist regime, and especially when the racial laws came and if he was of Jewish religion. For this reason, I found two documents that came from the Jewish part of my family. And these documents state that before a certain date, they had to say all the single houses and terrains that were of their property. And if they didn't do it before that date, then the fascist government would take the properties and the houses so that the land would probably become of property of the government, so probably public terrain, so that the government could have more money and more place to have some government paid associations or something like that. So this is a very important document also because it states how people must have lived in fear of losing their own belongings, how people were afraid of doing anything because of living under dictatorship and because they were effectively of another religion compared to the majority of Italian people. Another thing that concerned adult Jewish people under the fascist regime was the fact that, as well, just like the children, they couldn't go to work, as well as they couldn't go to school. For this reason, Ugo Fla's father, as he told me, went to work in Eastern Africa, in particular in Eritrea, because it was Italian territory, so he didn't need a visa to stay there. And also, even though the racial laws were applied to those countries also, as well, they weren't really respected, so it was an opportunity for him to get some money. But now let's move on to World War II.
Scoppiata la guerra del 40, Napoli era stata bombardata, è la città che è stata più bombardata d'Italia. E quindi è cominciato un altro periodo di giustizia, perché bombardamenti, un altro sconvolgimento non solo per gli ebrei, cioè per tutti, per i cittadini, bombardamenti simultaneamente, di svegli, di notte, di giorno, passi ore, le grotte del nascosto, tutti i bombardamenti sono cominciati leggeri e poi sono diventati pesantissimi.
As World War II touched the whole population and influenced more or less the whole population, and not only people of Jewish origin that were already touched by the racial laws, I decided to interview two people that were children when World War II started and are witnesses of that time period. Those two people are my grandparents, Maria Gabriella Righi and Giuseppe Coppi. However, I do believe that these two people require an introduction because some things that they said they haven't really explained fully or really mentioned. So, my grandfather, Giuseppe Coppi, was born in 1938 and he was the son of Alessandro Coppi. We will look at his figure a bit deeper as we go on in the documentary. Alessandro Coppi was part of the Committee of National Liberation. This means he was a partisan, and from 1943 to 1945 he was effectively the president of this committee in Modena. So as you can see, he was a pretty important figure when it came to the Liberation War. My grandmother instead, she was born in 1941, and she was the daughter of a soldier that during the colonial wars fought in Ethiopia. The soldier, when World War II started, was obliged to go to war, and so he was put on a boat. The problem is that as soon as the boat took off from Italy, it sunk because he was being sent to fight in France, and the French launched some bombs against his ship. The ship sunk, and he was caught prisoner and brought to a hospital in Ajaccio. Let's listen to their story.
Io sono nata nel 41, quindi sono nata quando già c'era la guerra. I miei ricordi però cominciano soltanto da quando con la famiglia, io e mia madre praticamente, lasciammo la città perché c'era il rischio di bombardamenti. E allora, come ormai facevano tutti quelli che ne avevano la possibilità, ci rifugiammo fuori città, noi in una casa che i miei nonni avevano sull'Appennino vicino a Guiglia, in un paesello che si chiamava Monte Orsello. Avevamo ospitato anche delle famiglie che erano fuggite dalla città e a cui avevamo lasciato un'ala della casa. Mi ricordo per esempio la notte, dormivo piccolino in una cameretta e si sentiva un aereo che girava la notte e si sentiva proprio il ronzio di questo aereo. La mattina sentivo che le persone in casa e dicevano: avete sentito Pippo? Io ho questo ricordo, poi mi hanno detto che Pippo non era altro che un aereo di ricognizione inglese. Poi mi ricordo per esempio ancora che mio padre aveva collocato tante cose che voleva tenere nascoste. Sotto un divano c'era una botola e si passava al piano di sotto dove tra le varie cose che avevano nascosto lì c'era anche una piccola radio che lui tirava fuori quando proprio pensava che nessuno ascoltasse o nessuno fosse presente, e la collocava nel vano di una finestra e sentivo che cercava di sintonizzarsi su una stazione ed era Radio Londra, poi mi hanno detto. Nel giardino trovarono a un certo punto una mattina un grande telo, una specie di grande fiore, immenso fiore bianco, era un paracadute che era arrivato nel giardino e tutti eravamo andati a guardare questo paracadute. E mi ricordo che si preoccuparono anche di recuperare la stoffa perché doveva essere preziosa anche quella. Poi dopo insomma si vede che la montagna non era neanche lì, la casa di montagna era sicura, e mio padre decise di ritornare in città. Quindi tornammo in città, lasciammo la casa di Montorsello, tornammo in città. Fu provvidenziale quel ritorno in quel momento perché effettivamente di lì a poco fu bombardato il campanile della chiesa, sotto il quale avevano trovato riparo come rifugio i pochi abitanti del paesello col parroco, e fu una strage perché rimasero tutta la miseria. E comunque di Modena invece ho dei ricordi della guerra cittadina, proprio mi ricordo che suonava la sirena quando cominciava un bombardamento, si sentivano proprio gli aerei avvicinarsi, al suono della sirena tutti si correva in luoghi che erano indicati come rifugi ed erano degli scantinati, dei palazzi in cui ci si stava affiancati gli uni agli altri, tutti zitti e muti, fin tanto che non risuonava la sirena, cessato allarme e si poteva ritornare in casa. Il nonno dice che fino al 43 non ha avuto consapevolezza che fossero in guerra. Erano stati a Modena fino all'estate del 43, vero? Dal 43 siete sfollati, anche voi, sono andati.
Secondo è stata visionata la casa di Modena.
Perché c'era stato un bombardamento.
Bombardamento.
E allora anche loro hanno deciso di sfollare, lasciare la città e di andare nella loro casa di campagna a Gorzano, dove andò tutta la famiglia. Zii, nonni, nonno, zii, e c'erano anche lì delle persone, delle famiglie, loro sfollate
Anche lì da noi.
che si erano accampate fortunatamente.
Mettono giù nelle cantine.
Poi all'inizio il nonno si ricorda che andava a scuola in paese, vero?
Sì.
Ma dopo invece
Io la seconda e la terza l'ho fatta in casa.
perché c'era
C'era sfollata
una
una maestra, si chiamava Stradi.
che teneva le lezioni a questi bambini, perché c'erano parecchi bambini, poi lui, i suoi fratelli e anche i figli degli sfollati. C'era una scuola in casa addirittura, E poi dopo addirittura si ricorda che una volta era sul Calessino con la zia a Pozza, è vero?
La zia Carta.
E ritornando lì da Pozza siete stati sorpresi.
Un bombardamento a Pozza che bombardavano la villa delle signorine
Obici. E da lì siete trottati via, scappati con sto cavallino, fortunatamente. E poi dopo ti ricordi che di notte si sentivano
di squadre,
di squadre.
non mica solo di notte, anche di giorno.
C'era un reparto di tedeschi acquartierato,
Noi avevamo in casa tedeschi.
acquartierato lì nei prati.
Comunque erano tedeschi buoni.
Ma la cosa strana è che i loro bambini non avevano assolutamente la consapevolezza dell'attività del padre, cioè tutte le cose relative proprio all'attività diciamo di coordinamento dell'azione partigiana del padre, loro non hanno saputo dopo. Hanno saputo dopo, anche perché lì bisognava stare proprio al sicuro, quindi doveva essere tutto tenuto nascosto. Poi si ricorda per esempio che una notte era una sparatoria tra partigiani e i tedeschi acquartierati lì.
I partigiani erano sul vecchio castello, sulla rovina del castello.
E sotto c'erano i tedeschi nel giardino.
Noi avevamo tedeschi in casa.
E poi c'erano anche delle difficoltà di viveri, di approvvigionamento dei viveri, quello è da ricordare, perché per esempio per cuocere la pasta si mette nell'acqua il sale, no? E anche il sale era prezioso, non si trovava. E allora con un carro tirato dai buoi, Dio dove andavate?
Andavamo alla Govana, sono i pozzi di acqua salata.
Andavano con un carro a prendere l'acqua salata.
Un carro delle vacche o dei buoi e riempivamo delle botti.
The 8th of September 1943, just as the Americans were coming up all the way, starting to get to central Italy, from Sicily, where they had landed, the king realized the big mistake he had made by letting Mussolini effectively run the country for so much, understanding the real power he had on the whole of the Italian population. So what he did is he exiled him, and eventually Mussolini managed to escape the exile held by the Germans and create the RSI, Repubblica Sociale Italiana, which was not a republic because it was effectively at 100% dictatorship because it was run entirely by him. And just as he founded the republic, the Nazi Germans approved of the final solution, which was a project thanks to which they would get rid of all the forms of the anti-Semitism and of the killing of Jewish people up until then. So Italy was basically obliged to comply with the Germans and agree with the final solution. Something terrible happened in the October of 1943. To be more precise, the 16th of October 1943, there was the Roman ghetto raid. This is a very terrible happening, and we've been in the Roman ghetto to see what actually happened and to feel on our skin how it must have been.
If you're wondering where we are right now, well, good question. Because we're in a time machine. Well, not quite. Because we're in a 1936 elevator that will be our time machine for this. Our journey starts here in our bed and breakfast. What's better say house where the 16th of October 1943. 3 people of Jewish origin were arrested and brought to Auschwitz.
Between 5:30 a.m. and 2 p.m., the SS raided the Rome ghetto, taking around 1,024 hostages in total. The SS loaded the prisoners on military trucks and brought them to the military college in Rome. But the really macabre fact that is usually forgotten about is that the SS had never seen Rome. They had come here only to fight. So what they did is they didn't take the shortest route to the military college, but instead they took a modified route that would take the soldiers around the city of Rome, sometimes even stopping and commenting about the beauties of the eternal city. From the military college to Salviati, the soldiers took the prisoners to Rome's Tiburtina station, where they were loaded on cargo wagons. They were brought to Poland and reached Auschwitz 6 days later. Of the total 1,024 prisoners taken to Auschwitz, only 16 survived. None of the children did.
Luckily though, our friend Ugo Foa managed to escape the deportations. This for a very simple reason, because just as the final solution was being approved, the Americans, thanks to the people from Naples, because of course he lived in Naples during World War II, managed to get rid of the fascists and Nazis from Naples. So only by a few days, only by less than a week, he managed to escape deportations, thanks to the 4 days of Naples.
A Napoli le leggi anti-ebrei sono durate 5 anni perché nel 1943, dopo 5 anni, sono arrivati gli americani, Napoli è stata liberata. Tutti e 5 anni ginnasio, e poi quando sono finiti eravamo stati liberati per fatti 3 anni di liceo, stati liceo classico per sempre da scuola. Ti lascia immaginare anche la gioia di tornare a scuola, rispondere all'appello senza paura.
As you have seen, Ugo Foa managed to redeem his lost freedom because of the basically escaping of the fascist and Nazi troops. But the northern parts of Italy was still under Nazi and fascist rule. So as the Americans slowly managed to go up north and up north and up north, and they reached the Gothic line, up until then and up until the 25th of April 1945, when the Liberation occurred, there was a movement called the Partisans. Now, the Partisans weren't really an army. They were a disorganized group of people that fought against the fascists, and these really helped to get rid of the fascists and help the Americans in their efforts to liberate Italy. My grandfather, he was the son of the person who was the president of the Committee of National Liberation in Modena. But the interesting fact, as we have heard, is that he didn't know anything about it because this movement was entirely secret. And even to cover up his name, my great-grandfather Alessandro Coppi had to use what you would call a battle name, and his name was Tommaso. But how must it have felt being liberated? What was it like to see the Americans coming through your hometown? People with a uniform they weren't familiar with were overwhelmed. Let's see how my grandmother describes this feeling.
Ricordo invece quando c'è stata la liberazione in aprile, erano giornate ventose con delle grandi bandiere che sventolavano, eccitazione della gente, e mi ricordo poi successivamente quando passavano gli americani con i cani, tutti allegri sui cani distribuendo caramelle, cioccolato, sigarette, già si camminava tranquillamente, si passeggiava quasi per di nuovo, e quella era la pace, insomma.
As you have heard, the idea and concept of freedom and peace stuck in a 4-year-old's mind. Now, this tells us a lot about how war affects the mind of little children that at the time wouldn't be expected to, remember what's taking place because of their tender age. After the liberation, the 25th of April 1945, that's when things really started to change, because it's when war was effectively over for Italians, and it's when a new government needed to come. Let's look at Palazzo di Montecitorio, where the beginning of a new era started.
The 2nd of June 1946, for the first time since 1924, Italian people were allowed to vote. And for the first time ever in the Italian history, women were allowed to vote too. The voting card presented two options, either Kingdom or the Republic. The Republic won with a total of 12,700,000 votes, against 10,700,000 votes for the Kingdom. Those 2 million people were the thin line and the really big difference between an anachronistic kingdom and a modern republic. Of course, with a new government come new laws. For this reason, the Constitutional Assembly was created that operated between the 25th of June 1946 and the 31st of January 1948. By the 22nd of December 1947, the Constitution was written and approved, but it only became the official legislation up until the 27th of December of the same year. The building behind me, Palazzo di Montecitorio, has been the background to all these drastic changes in the Italian government, and it's where the Constitutional Assembly meetings took place. All of them took place in this building right here, and where Enrico De Nicola, at the time President of Italy, posed his signature on the final copy of the Italian Constitution. I have decided to teach you this particular chapter in history through the story of a person that's always been hidden by history. This person is my great-grandfather, Alessandro.
Alessandro Coppi was born in 1884, precisely the 16th of July. And since he was very young, as we have already seen before, he was profoundly anti-fascist. He thus started collaborating with an anti-fascist movement even before fascism took place and became the official government of Italy in 1922. And as time went on, his anti-fascist feelings continued growing, and no one could ever stop them. And this was very positive because once World War II ended, and as we have seen before, he was president of the CLN, he was elected at the Chamber of Deputies in order to write the new Italian Constitution. I have interviewed my grandfather, his son, that has testimonied what he remembers about him and generally what he did both before and after being elected.
Ottobre 1943 fu riconosciuto presidente del Comitato di Liberazione Nazionale
della provincia di Modena.
si dedicò a nuovi impegni,
incurante della sua professione, della famiglia e anche della sua
sicurezza personale. Il 20 marzo del 1945 fu arrestato e tradotto all'Accademia Militare di Modena,
che allora hai detto era prigione.
che allora era serviva la prigione.
Quindi fu trattenuto per ben 9
giorni. Dopodiché si rifugiò in Campania, a Gorzano, e qui nei pressi
di Gorzano, ebbe un incontro fortunoso con una
incontro con una missione militare
inglese,
a cui garantì che l'azione partigiana
avrebbe liberato
la città dai tedeschi, evitando bombardamenti a tappeto
sulla città stessa,
distruggendola completamente. Continuò a mantenere continui e frequenti contatti con gli amici.
alla macchia, erano partigiani. Il suo
nome
nome in codice era
Tommaso, finché il 23 aprile 1945, con la liberazione della provincia di Modena, assunse la funzione di governo della provincia, dedicandosi alle necessità di riordinamento della provincia dopo la conquistata libertà. Tra il giugno del 1946 e il gennaio del 1948 poteva capitare che venissero recapitate a Modena, dove abitavamo, lettere che portavano intestazione a Montecitorio, assemblea costituente. Allora avevo 8 anni e a scrivermi da lì era mio padre, Alessandro Coppi, che aveva lasciato il suo studio
di avvocato
a Modena per partecipare ai lavori dell'Assemblea Costituenti che si tenevano appunto a Roma, a Palazzo Montecitorio. Questa sua attività, ispirata ad un alto ideale di libertà,
per abbattere una dittatura ultraventennale,
è stato nominato tra 556 eletti alla Costituente per scrivere la nuova Costituzione dell'Italia repubblicana.
When part of the Constitutional Assembly, he was part of the DC Party, which was the Christian Democracy Party. And he wasn't one of the most important ones, but he was in contact with some of the most important ones, and he did manage to work on some articles, including Article 96 of the Italian Constitution and Article 100 bis of the Italian Constitution. This underlines how important he is, and he is a very, very interesting figure when it comes to how life was first days of the Italian Republic. I have gathered some sources that were owned directly by him that really underline how it must have been living in Italy in that time period. Now let's have a look at them right now. The sources that I have selected to show you are these ones in front of you. Now, this one isn't really very relevant, but it shows that he was part of the Chamber of Deputies up until 1954, when he wasn't re-elected. So this is just for interest in general. Then there are these 4 envelopes that really tell a lot about how Italy was in those years. we need to imagine Italy as a very poor country, very much differently from what it is now. But what can these letters tell us about Italy? Well, noticeably, they have written on them Chamber of Deputies and Constitutional Assembly. These two ones are the standardized ones. But if you look closely, now I'm gonna zoom in for you in one of these. So, this one is a very, very interesting piece, because as you can see, there's written Chamber of Deputies, but below there's written Camera dei Fasci e delle Corporazioni. You might wonder why. Well, because Italy at the time was so poor that couldn't even afford to take so many letters and just print them. So what they did is they took some old letters from the old government, covered up the old insignias, and wrote down the new ones. And we can see very clearly that it wasn't deleted on the inside. It was still written and it wasn't deleted. You can see the faces over here. The other source that I'd like to show you today is this one, a watch. You might wonder, Tommy, why are you showing us a watch? So this is a watch owned by my great-grandfather, and he had another one before this one. And the problem is that during a parliament session, it was stolen by a politician, presumably. So he had his watch stolen in parliament. You can imagine a politician stealing a watch. This really tells us how Italy was poor back in the day, so he had to buy this watch. We have finally got to an end to today's lesson. I really hope you enjoyed it, because in order to realize this documentary, I had to go all around Italy, basically. Going from Modena to Rome to meet people, I had to contact people, I had to visit the whole city of Rome, and through this documentary, we've inspected history through a very thoroughly analyzed timeline, going from the beginning of the fascist era in 1922 all the way to its end, and even explored further how the Italian Republic was made. I hope you enjoyed it, because it's something you don't really get that often, getting such a thorough explanation of history, of a very long chapter in history, because it's a very complicated one in such a short amount of time. And as always, thanks for listening.